I'm Matt Reynolds, and this is my podcast.
I can do the job, but running the business is quite difficult. What a lot of tradesmen lack, and I was probably one of them, is business skills.
I don't mind making mistakes. You learn from your mistakes.
Information is all around you in the minds of people that work beside you.
Welcome back to the Trench Talk podcast. I'm your host, Matt Reynolds, and today I spoke with Gavin Routledge of Active X-Backs out of Edinburgh in Scotland. The idea of these discussions, for those of you joining us for the first time, is to go into the trenches of achievement and talk not with people who are orchestrating from some lofty perspective, but to those high performers who are actually in the trenches honing their craft. That has included guests from the worlds of business, sport and entertainment, all of whom are on the front lines doing amazing things. Gavin is an osteopath with 30 years professional experience in lower back pain and sciatica. Gavin graduated in 1991 from the British School of Osteopathy as a Gold Medallist and is now a Vice Patron at the University College of Osteopathy. He co-authored the book, The Back Book, with Gavin Hastings OBE in 1996, and in 2017 he authored Active X-Backs, a long-term solution to lower back pain. He is a much sought-after public speaker on the topics of pain health and physical activity. Gavin is passionate about helping to move people as far away from illness and pain as possible. He practices what he preaches, including cycling, running, swimming, bodyweight and free weight training, practising yoga and meditation. As Chief Back Officer of Active X-Backs in his practice, Gavin leads his team to provide both clinical care and online consultations to individuals, health and fitness professionals, and organisations looking to provide their clients with online care. During our chat, we covered a lot, including setting goals and why they play such a big role in health, pain management and recovery, how to sit correctly to help avoid back pain, changes in load and activity and how to minimise risk of injury, particularly during exercise, the role your attitude plays towards pain, daily exercises to help protect against body imbalance, how Gavin has taken his business online, and as always, much more. To find out more about Gavin's company, Active X-Backs, head to active-x.co.uk, or you can track him down personally on LinkedIn. If you enjoy Trench Talk, head to xrm.com.au/podcast and opt in for the newsletter. We'll make sure you're notified when every new episode of the show is released. Trench Talk is available everywhere good podcasts are served, so if you're feeling super nice, please leave a review, comment, rating, or whatever your chosen podcast platform allows. Obviously, this conversation should not be taken as medical advice and is for informational purposes only. Enjoy this chat with Gavin Routledge. Gavin, thanks for doing this.
Delighted to be here, Matt.
Now, I am in my home office, what is my evening, Monday evening. Whereabouts are you situated and what time of the day is it? Because we are at a distance, so we're recording this over Zoom today.
Yeah, so I am in, as we call it, bonnie Scotland, Edinburgh, the capital of Scotland. It is now coming up for 11:15 in the morning. And as I was saying to you off mic, it's pouring with rain and 13 degrees in the peak of our summer.
Oh, wow. Something to look forward to as soon as we've finished this, right? Get out in the rain, I guess. Now, as I wanted to sort of broadly speaking to set this up, first of all, the people that you deal with predominantly, is it mostly older people or is it younger people, or are we all affected by back pain, and can we be affected at any time of our lives?
Yeah, I mean, historically, so I've been doing this nearly 30 years. So probably if you'd asked me this 20 years ago, I would give you the stock answer that most people with persistent lower back pain are over 40, especially over 50. But increasingly, we're seeing more and more younger people with it now. It will definitely affect 80% of the adult population at some time in their lives. But yeah, as I say, we seem to see more and more younger people as well as the kind of bread and butter over 50s as well.
And to simplify things a lot, does most back pain come or originate from losing the integrity of the arch in your lower spine? Now, we can probably jump into a number of different reasons why that actually does happen. But am I right in sort of assuming that so early in this conversation or not?
Whew, that's a big topic, Matt. Yes and no is the straight answer.
I was going out a little bit on a limb trying to talk to you about what you do. But
Yeah, you are. It's a very controversial way to open it up, Matt. I think for some people, the structural element is definitely a factor. But for many people, or most of us, lower back pain is multifactorial. There's a whole bunch of different things that all come together over time to eventually lead to a problem, rather than just the structural element.
So you say there's a trend towards younger people that you're seeing, or you're seeing more younger people. Are there any commonalities in the aspects that cause their back pain?
Yeah. Coming back to that point of lower back pain is multifactorial, one of the biggest predictors for lower back pain is lack of physical activity. So, just as we're seeing around the developed world a rise in obesity, we're also seeing a rise in pain for the same common reasons, that people are not as physically active as they would have been a generation or two ago. So, yeah, that's a big part of it. It's just not moving around enough.
So just purely a symptom of that sedentary lifestyle is what you're saying, right?
Yeah, I guess it's in vogue to blame technology, and possibly there is an element of that. But, other people will say, well, look, reading a book is a pretty sedentary activity as well. And we've been doing that for hundreds of years, or, well, some people have. So I think that's fair, that it's not about technology, it's about our use of technology and how much time people spend on technology, whether that's sitting at a computer in a sedentary job or being on the bus looking at their smartphone. It's just people are spending too much time being passive and not active enough.
So is it simply a case of becoming more active, or do we need to go about these activities differently? Because maybe a few years ago to get through the day without a smartphone would be, or cut that time down would be very easy. But in today's world, it's becoming more and more difficult, rightly or wrongly, to be able to do that.
Yeah, it's definitely a case of becoming more active. And there are ongoing debates in the research community about what kind of activities are right for which types of lower back pain. And that research is still ongoing, so that's still a bit unclear. But broadly, we know that any physical activity is better than none. And that's not just true for lower back pain, that's pretty much true for everything, mental health as well. But certainly as a clinician who's specialised in this domain for a long time, my experience in clinical practice is that some people respond better to some types of exercise than others do. And I guess that's the value of seeing someone who specializes in this stuff, is working through, what works best for you as an individual, rather than just giving you some kind of, just do some stretches for your back and you'll feel better. That unfortunately just doesn't work for some people.
So you got into this originally, was it a result of you suffering quite a bit of back pain in your 20s, is that right?
I got into being an osteopath simply through playing rugby when I was a teenager and having a bit of a neck injury. Not a bad one by any stretch, but, it was painful for several weeks. And eventually my mum kind of noticed I was still doing this kind of rigid robotic turn of my body instead of turning my head. She dragged me along to see this old osteopath in Glasgow in the west of Scotland. And he pretty much fixed me in an instant, in a blink of an eye, clicked my neck. And I thought, wow, that is amazing. And that set me on that course. So I had to choose between medicine and osteopathy. I chose osteopathy and I've never looked back. But yes, then I did, ironically, develop lower back pain when I was an osteopathic student. They do say that it takes you 4 years to graduate and 7 years to recover. And I pretty much fit that description. So, that was a bad period in life, definitely. But I learned a lot from it. That's the flip side. Is making all the mistakes yourself is one good way of learning, in my experience. So, a lot of lower back pain in my 20s.
So why did you stick with it? Is that just part and parcel of sort of going through your training at that point? Or I'm assuming that some people don't recover and don't go on to a career in your field?
Well, yeah, but it's a very mild thing. They may maybe have the odd niggle here or there. For me, it was very profound pain at times and recurred quite frequently. So it was quite disabling. I had to give up rugby. I gave up playing competitive squash. I used to be very wary of locking my bike up in the morning because just that act of bending over, I had found through experience, I'd get these kind of spasms in my lower back. So it certainly never occurred to me to not continue with osteopathy. Maybe I'm a slow learner. and to be fair, for me, we talk about it being multifactorial. I think some of the things that other people did to me when I was an osteopathic student in terms of practicing techniques almost certainly aggravated my condition, but they weren't the main cause. The main cause was years of bad weight training technique, trauma through rugby, and sitting, an awful lot of sitting, slump. I was a real sloucher, not standing, but sitting, a classic sort of teenage lad. I would slump down in my chair. And it just, amazing as it seems to me now, knowing everything that I know, I just never put two and two together and realized that sitting was a major aggravating factor for my lower back pain.
So what do we need to be careful about when we are sitting? Because it's another one of those kind of necessary things in life, right? We do have to sit down from time to time, whether it be at a desk or to drive to a job or whatever. So what do we need to be aware of when we are sitting? Because I'm assuming that a lot of people that you see, maybe this sort of stuff can creep up with them, as it maybe did with you over time, and all of a sudden you've got a problem, whereas it's really stemmed from, as you said, maybe years or decades of actually doing the wrong thing.
Yeah, and just to pick up on that point briefly, Matt, people, when I often say to them, it's your sitting that's aggravating your back, they'll say, but I've been sitting like this for years, as if that's a defense. And I say, that's exactly why this is now a problem. It's built up. So I think one of the most important things I always say to people when it comes to sitting is don't believe that there is a perfect posture. Any position that you spend prolonged periods of time in will come at a cost. So, in the health and safety world, they often promote this idea of sitting at 90-degree angles. So you should have 90 degrees at ankles, knees, hips, and elbows. And I think that's done a grave disservice to people because it's caused them to sit in this one position for prolonged periods. But the problem is, the longer you stay in any one position, you have what we call sustained loading. So a constant load, and you and I are communicating via video here as well as audio. But for those that can't see, basically, if you take your forefinger and bend it backwards and hold it in that position. Now, initially, you can hold it there and it's perfectly tolerable. It's not particularly uncomfortable. But if you hold that there for 20, 30 minutes at a time, eventually it'll start to hurt. And that's your body saying, stop it. You're exceeding its capacity to cope with the load. And you'll see it in your work, any physical structure. If you keep a constant load on it, eventually it will fatigue and give. And fortunately, when it comes to the body, we have a warning system, and it's called pain. So, if you're sitting for half an hour and your back starts to ache, that's your back's way of saying, stop doing it. Cut it out. So, coming a long way of saying, my number one piece of advice is move frequently. Don't stay in one position for very long. Keep shifting the load. Have 2 or 3 static postures. So, that kind of classic sitting upright, ideally with your hips above your knees, which makes it easier to maintain the arch and the small of your back. That could be one position. Another could be what we call a supported slump, which is no good for working at a keyboard. But if you're like me and you're your own boss and you need to spend a bit of time just thinking, particularly what I like to call creative thinking, and my wife calls gazing at the ceiling, then,
wasting time.
Make sure, you get a support on the small of your back, crank the seat back and just, recline. There's nothing wrong with a supported slump. And then maybe a third position would just be standing, why sit? We've got legs, use them, so stand up for a while. And as we were talking about off mic, wobble, don't sit still. Keep on the move, wobble from cheek to cheek while you're working.
Just going by your name, Active Backs, obviously being active is a component of a healthy back, right? Yeah. So can you be too active?
Yeah, you can be too active in the sense that if you do the same thing repeatedly, arguably, you might say that something's going to wear out. So for years, the conventional wisdom was that marathon runners are going to end up with bad knees. But actually, they found that that isn't the case. And in fact, there's a guy very close to home for you, an Aussie researcher whose name is Tim Gabbett. And, a lot of the stuff I do in clinic is standing on the shoulders of giants. And Tim is very much a giant in the world of sports performance research. So I'm wary of citing Tim's research inaccurately, but in essence, he focuses very much on load and the relationship between recent load and long-term load exposure. And as I say, he focuses very much on top sports teams and sports people. But the principles can apply across the board, I would argue. So, long answer again, Matt.
That's all right. We like long answers around here. So
good.
You go for it.
A long answer on this one. So, in terms of how long should you do something and will you wear out, it looks like it's important to not change things suddenly. And this is really relevant around this kind of coronavirus period we're in, because at the moment we've got people who have been used to doing a particular lifestyle and then suddenly they've changed. And then equally suddenly they're probably going to go back to that old lifestyle. And so you've got a sudden change in exposure, or as Tim would call it, load. So let's say you're used to sitting for long periods and you've been doing that for years. And your body is used to that. It's able to cope with that. But then all of a sudden, and we often see this clinical practice, people think, standing is good. So they go from, maybe only standing for a total of an hour in a day to standing for 4 hours because they heard that was good for them. But they've done it too quickly. So there's too rapid a change in loading. And you'll know this as a cyclist, your body's used to a certain level of cycling.
Yeah, it is.
And if you suddenly ramp it up, your risk of injury goes through the roof. So anyway, I haven't cited it very well, but basically he talks about acute loading. So let's call that the last 4 weeks compared with the previous 4 months or 4 years. And he has a ratio, and my understanding is you want to keep that ratio between 0.8 and 1.3. So if you go above 1.3, then your risk of injury increases significantly.
And you're talking 4-week blocks?
Yeah, I think it's all relative. So you could pretty much name any time periods you like. So if we chose 4 weeks as the recent, what we call acute period, you might compare that against the previous 4 months or 4 years. But you might just choose, let's say the last week and compare that with the previous month. So it's whatever your body is used to over a period of time. If you significantly up it, then your risk of injury goes through the roof.
And it's pretty easy to, particularly on the exercise front, it's pretty easy to track most of this stuff these days too, isn't it? With watches and apps and that sort of thing to sort of make sure you don't fall out of that. But I mean, realistically, I wouldn't expect a lot of people who are really going to be constantly pushing that 1.3 for long periods of time, right? Because it takes a lot of determination and effort just in the output of doing that for a long period of time. So, I mean, if you are doing it, you're going to be very well aware that you are. So for the average person that just is sort of going through life, it's not really a consideration that's going to just sneak up on you, right? Like it's not going to come and sort of grab you in terms of training too much or anything like that.
No, although you see it a lot. I mean, one good example is people who decide they're going to run a marathon, but they've only run like 10K runs. And so all of a sudden they decide, right, tomorrow I'm going to do 13 miles and next week I'm going to do, 16 miles. And they just ramp it up too fast. And they get, whether it be an Achilles problem or a knee problem, and they get really focused on what we call the tissue causing symptoms. Have I strained my Achilles? Have I got patella tendonitis? And actually what's more important is what's the mechanism? Yeah, how did you cause it? Because the tissue is going to settle. If you just give it a bit of time, it'll settle back down. What you need to know is how did you do it? And more likely than not in that scenario, it's because you ramped it up too fast. So, and it seems like common sense, but it's great that there are researchers out there proving how this works and that you need to go about building things. I think one of the phrases, again, we use in rehab is start low, build slow. Because we don't know how your body's going to respond. So just be sensible, start at a low level and build it up slowly.
Yeah, it's funny on the exercise front, isn't it? I was having this conversation the other day about someone with their particular training program, and I guess you'd say they were a little concerned with their progress and how they were going. And this is by me, who's completely unqualified, by the way, but just said, look, it's not a week-by-week thing. This is a rest of your life thing. You know, if you start thinking about it in those terms, it makes today a lot easier to kind of go through, because you don't have to lift that weight or run that distance or whatever if you give yourself more time to do it. And let's face it, I'm 40 myself. I'm getting sort of past the age where any NBA team is going to call me up, or anything like that's going to happen. So you're really not going to get paid, I suppose, for your efforts if you want to look at it like that. So you do have a lot more time than what you probably do think.
Yeah.
So of the people that come in and that you treat, what's a typical path to help them become pain-free? Is there a system that you work through? I mean, I'm sure it's obviously a little bit specific, but is there common areas you start with at all?
Yes, I mean, we definitely have systems. So one of the first things we always want to do is identify what are you doing that's aggravating your problem. So this is based on the insight that most people will get better if they operate under the right conditions. And I used to, going way back to my osteopathic student days, we used to have a tutor who was originally a psychologist, so he was a strange combination of a psychologist and osteopath. And he had a great sense of, a wry sense of humour. So we'd present the students, we'd just present the case to him. We'd say, this, we found this, that, and the other, and then we'd have to tell him what we thought we were going to do to help that person. And just as we were walking away down the corridor, he would say, "Oh, Gavin." And then you'd turn around and he'd say, "Yeah." And then he'd say, "Don't forget, most of your patients will get better despite what you do to them," which was a real leveler when, you're putting kind of all your effort into becoming an osteopath. And he says, they'll get better despite what you do to them rather than because of what you do to them. So the first place we start with is, what are you doing that's stopping you from getting better? Because if we don't identify that at the beginning, then as a clinician, we're going to fail you. It doesn't matter how good the treatment is. If you keep aggravating it, it's not going to get better. So a lot of our questioning is based around that initially. And that usually comes down to movement. So what movements are you doing? What postures are you adopting that may be aggravating this problem and preventing healing from taking place? But sometimes it's also about attitude. So there are some tools that we sometimes use, brief questionnaires that measure people's attitude to their pain. And that can help to highlight people who essentially are more at risk of, well, they have what we call yellow flags. So there are people who are very good at turning a crisis into a drama. And if you're one of those people, then, that's not good, because you'll tend to think, oh, no, my back, I've prolapsed a disc, it'll always be a problem. My dad had a problem and his dad had a problem and I'm always going to have a problem. That is a really bad place to start from. So we try and identify all of those factors initially and address those. And then we move on to, obviously, we need to screen people for more medical causes of back pain and sciatica. And there are a simple series of screening questions we use to do that. And once we're confident that this is fundamentally not a medical or pathological problem, then they're definitely in our camp. And then it's all about building a plan for the long term. We are not terribly interested in just short-term relief because, as I said earlier, nature can do that bit. You're probably aware, Matt, I have this thing I've used for 20 plus years called the cliff of pain. And in essence, it works like this. You can imagine you're traveling along through life, happy, 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 and then all of a sudden you fall off that cliff edge and you find yourself in the sea of pain. And people focus on just getting up onto the cliff top again. They just want to get out of pain. But the problem is, if that's as far as they go, they're still on the edge. And all it takes is another puff of wind and they fall off again. And so they yo-yo up and down that cliff edge for years often, as I did back in my 20s. So what we focus on is getting them as far back from the edge as possible. And to do that, you have to have a big plan, a big vision for what you want to be able to do, which means your back needs to be robust enough to be able to do that. So, yeah, we do have a system.
I did want to ask about this relationship with pain, because it seems to be one of the key differences between particularly high-performing athletes and the ordinary person. And you have a situation, the one that I could think of today when I was kind of putting this question together in my mind was, now the late Kobe Bryant had an incident in a game where he tore an Achilles, but he was fouled on the play and still went to the foul line and shot those shots before he left the court. Then you've got people on the other end of the spectrum that kind of a fly lands on their shoulder and they have a meltdown. So there's quite a range within there. So you said that you have tools to fix, would you call it poor attitudes towards pain? What does that process look like, even in just a high level way? Because increasing that threshold in most instances can only be an advantage, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to correct you, Matt, I said that we had tools to identify them.
Excuse me, I'm sorry.
Rather than tools to fix them. Yeah, there is a big gulf here. So fixing those attitudes and beliefs is really tough. But definitely identifying them, there are what we call clinically validated tools, questionnaires that you basically get people to tick a bunch of boxes and you look at their responses and you can say, yeah, okay, you're definitely someone who tends to catastrophize, is a phrase we often use in the medical parlance. But as I say, that's someone who looks at a situation and makes it blacker than you or I might make it look, like the fly landing on your shoulder. You're like, geez, it's just a fly. Whereas to them, it's like, the end of the world has arrived. So identifying those are widely used tools, although often not in private practice, but they certainly are in public medicine, particularly when you get into what we call pain clinics. So clinics that are set up specifically to deal with people who have chronic and persistent pain, they will all use these kind of tools to identify people who are very prone to catastrophizing. But in terms of how do we shift people out of that, how we do it in practical terms, and you've got to be aware, and if you're sitting listening to this and thinking, well, yeah, I may be a little bit like that, it's tough, and it doesn't help when somebody points it out to you. So we try not to go that route. It's very much more we try and encourage people to focus on the long-term outcome that they want, not focus on where they are, accept that, do you know what, physiologically, there is every reason that your body can recover from this. But we need to identify some of the bad habits you've got and try and eliminate those, cut them out. But we also need you to decide, where do you want to be? Now, let's not worry about where you are now. Where do you want to be, and focus on that long-term vision that's going to motivate you from day to day, week to week, to keep moving in that direction. And that's our approach is, let's not worry too much about the small details. Let's just have a big vision and then we can work out the steps to get there.
And I'm going to assume here that the quicker you can sort of identify, that bigger vision, possibly the quicker your recovery becomes, because the path there becomes easier to endure, knowing that there's an end game in play, if I get that right.
Yeah.
And generally speaking, I'm sure it's not true in 100% of cases.
Yeah, I suppose if you look at it on a micro level, you mentioned Kobe Bryant and going to the line to take his free shots. Well, he had a real purpose there. He didn't have time to think about the fact that his ankle wasn't working properly. He was just focused on, I got to take those shots and I got to get the ball in the basket. And that's a very brief goal, but the same thing works across a long time span. If you don't have a long-term motivating goal, and we know this in business, this is true just as it is when it comes to health, that you very easily get distracted. And I've seen this for, best part of 30 years in clinical practice, is that as soon as people start to feel a bit better, they go back to their old habits. And those are the habits that caused the problem in the first place. And that's why they have a recurrence of their problem. So just getting out of pain is not motivating enough to keep you going in the right direction. You have to have a much bigger vision than just, I need to fix this pain.
If you've got an idea percentage, how much, I guess, is in a lot of ways mindset on this and how much is actually physically getting it done?
I would argue that all behavior is driven by what's between your ears. And because we're talking about long-term behavior change, you could argue this is 100% mental. And actually, the physical, while it's a physical experience people are having, the solution to that experience is behavior change, is doing things differently. And what drives that is your mind. So I think if you win the mind, you win it all.
Yeah, it's a great attitude to have, even if you don't really believe that to be the case, right? And I'm with you with what you're saying. But to think about it any other way really puts you at a significant disadvantage, doesn't it, really? So you want to have that attitude where you can take a problem and seize it, whether it be your back or another issue in life, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, one of the biggest problems in healthcare and medicine is the terminology that we use. So the whole word patient, it has the same derivation as passive. And this is why we, as you say, we have active in our business name, is that, we have what we call active Xers. So our full business name is Active X Backs. So the people who are with us are active Xers. They're getting on with their lives. They're being active. We don't want to call them patients because, that just smacks of, well, you know what, you've got a problem and, you'll need to come and see us and, we'll sort it out for you. But, you are a patient in this process. And that's just all wrong when it comes to language.
It's even the health system, right? It's kind of really a sickness system when you start thinking about it, because a lot of it is not geared to, unfortunately, moving you towards health. Now, I did want to spend a little bit of time on the business side of stuff with you, because you have been able to move what is a service business online, business side of stuff with you, because you have been able to move what is a service business online to allow you to service more clients and what you can actually just see, which in a service business is traditionally pretty difficult, right? Because we normally have to be with patients. So
Sure.
First of all, I wanted to ask where that idea came from, and then maybe the first steps that you took to making that happen, and then the story of that, of where you are now and what you can actually do online, which is particularly important, as you mentioned before, in this coronavirus period that we're all dealing with.
Yeah, this is a long answer. So if I go off track, pull me back in, Matt.
I can do that.
So where did it start? I was doing a master's degree in pain management online. There's a very good one based out of one of the Australian unis. I forget which one, and they have a collaboration with Edinburgh University. So I did the Edinburgh University one. But, I was working full time, had my own business. So, there's no way I could go to uni. So doing it online was a good way to go for me. And this was I think I started it in 2012, finished in 2015. And it was the first big chunk of formal learning I had done since graduating as an osteopath in 1991. And it really opened my eyes to the science of pain. I've been a clinician for however many years that was, 20 odd years, but I didn't know what I didn't know. So suddenly I was learning things and, it was like the curtain was lifting. I was like, oh man, that's why these people keep coming back, or it's why those people don't get better or whatever. So I'm a huge fan of education, not just for the heck of it, but for when it massively can be leveraged to improve the service that you offer humanity. So I did the master's, and as part of that, I reviewed all the apps on the App Store for lower back pain. And at the time, in 2014, there were 232 on the Apple Store and similar number on the Google Play Store as well.
Oh, wow.
Now, I didn't physically review all of them, so I had a way of sifting through them to work out which ones are actually worth looking at in any detail. But collectively, my conclusion was that they're pretty rubbish, and I thought I could do a lot better job than that. So when I was writing this up, my supervisor at Edinburgh University said, well, why don't you do that? There's this public body over here called the Digital Health and Care Institute in Scotland where you can get some funding if you've got an idea. And so, I started that process then, looking at building an app fundamentally to help people with lower back pain. But as you and your listeners will know, you get sidetracked, or you do if you're me, And, I thought my business vision kept changing. I got distracted. It was a little bit like the dog with a bone looking in the water. I thought I could do something bigger and better. And so, I tried something else. So long and short was, it took me a long time to get not very far. But eventually, we now have on our own website a bot that I have programmed to essentially work out for people not what is wrong with them in terms of, as I said, disc, muscle, ligament, tendon, because that's not terribly important. But more importantly, what are the things that they're doing that are aggravating their problem, and what exercises should and could they be doing to help themselves? So that's what our bot does, and we're just gradually iterating that so that ultimately it will become a fully fledged medical device. So an app that supports people without a clinician being necessary.
Oh, wow.
So that's the kind of long-term goal, but that's an iterative process. In the meantime, people can use it for free, and it will send you a PDF, and it links into, we have an online course. So it will tell you in the online course what sorts of stuff you should be paying attention to. So we're just slowly tying up the knowledge with the technology and learning from what people like and what they don't like, how to make this better and better, which apparently is the way you're meant to build technology rather than just try and build a rocket ship from the beginning, which is something I have tried in the past and failed miserably at.
Yeah, it's funny. They don't often work out real well, those ones, do they?
No.
But it doesn't stop any of us from trying.
I don't know if you're like me, Matt, but I have to learn from my own mistakes rather than accept other people's advice.
Yeah, I've been there before, and probably will be there again. So, yeah, I understand. So let's just say, I'll give you an example, and just so I can get a rough idea of how you've done this. I'm assuming it's a series of questions. So let's say that myself, I have a little bit of lower back pain, maybe not enough that I'm going to rush to the doctor or anything like that. I go to your website with the bot now, and then you ask questions, or how does that actually?
Yeah. So one of the first things the bot does is work out, should you be going to see your doctor? So there are those, what we call safety questions in the first stage of that question answer process. And that will work out, look, basically, you're fine. Or, well, there's things there that we flagged up, and maybe that requires not, and we particularly in this age of COVID-19, we don't want people rushing off overloading the medical services, so we don't encourage them to do that. We just log it, and I will then get in contact with a person to flag this up, to say, look, this is flagged up, so do you want to do an online consultation? Do you want to go and see your own doc? It's entirely up to you. There's no kind of hard sell. We just need to flag up that there's this possibility. So that's the first thing it does, is work out the kind of safety element. And then by a process, again, of question and answer, it works out, fundamentally, are you worse for bending forwards or worse for bending backwards? It might seem obvious that you could just ask them that, is your pain worse for, but actually, for some people, it isn't that simple. So they might be worse bending forwards after a while, but not initially. Initially, they might actually feel better for just kind of stretching the lower back forwards. But in the long term, and again, this is dependent on the questions that we use and the answers given, we can work out that actually you are worse for doing a lot of bending forwards. And so we're building up a picture of the aggravating and relieving factors for that individual, so that we can then give them what we call a functional assessment. So they actually go away from that interaction with a label, not a diagnosis, but a label that then they can then use in our online course to know which exercises are most relevant for them, and also which postures and so on they'd be better to minimize in the short term. So yeah, it's basically about educating people and then giving them the resources they need based on their particular problem, not some kind of, you've got a disc problem, so all people with disc problems should avoid X. It's not that straightforward by any means. So it's very much functionally related.
So do you have maybe a quick 3 or 4 exercises or whatever it is that you should be able to do pain-free as a checking mechanism, or not really? It doesn't really work like that.
Do you mean to establish whether your back's fine?
Yeah, or whether you've got any reason for concern, because these things build up over time. It might be a 4 or 5 year build up. Then is there anything you can do in that time to identify any loss of movement maybe that you might have, rather than waiting until you fall off that cliff and go looking for a solution for that?
Yeah, so again, I'd have to go back to the research evidence in answering that question, Matt, and this is not me, this is me standing on the shoulders of giants. There isn't a lot of evidence that having particular physical capacities or capabilities predicts whether you will or will not develop lower back pain.
Is that right?
Yeah. So you might think, oh, if you got tight, restricted hamstrings, you're more likely to strain your back bending forwards. That's a kind of popular belief, but actually there isn't any evidence for that when you look at the research. What there is evidence for, so there's a guy who's now retired, but again, I'm standing on his shoulders, Stuart McGill, who is a professor of biomechanics from Canada, one of the universities there. And a lot of his research is about trying to work out exactly that. What physical parameters predict who's going to develop lower back pain? And so some of his research indicated that there is a ratio, and again, this is in very specific groups of people. So I think this particular research was related to firefighters, a particular age group of firefighters. So it might have been, and I can't remember exactly, but let's say 25 to 45-year-old male firefighters. They found that if they compared their endurance capacity of what Stuart refers to as their front, back, and side muscles, so these are what are frequently referred to as core stabilizing muscles, but personally I try and stay away from that phrase because it just gets complicated, and everybody thinks that that's the answer. So anyway, Stuart's research showed that there is a ratio. It's important that both sides are equal, for instance. So let's say you're doing a side plank, and that would be his way of testing your side muscle endurance. So if you can side plank on one side for a minute before you start shaking, and on the other side you can do 2 minutes, then you've got an imbalance. And that was a predictor for lower back pain. And I think this group of firefighters were a group who had not had lower back pain before. So, they'd started out healthy. They did these tests at the beginning of the period, and then they tracked them over a number of years and worked out, to see who would develop lower back pain. So they found that it's important to have symmetry between left and right. And there's also an importance of having a healthy ratio between front and back muscles. So whether your front muscles are really strong and have great endurance capacity, whereas your back muscles are relatively weak and tired quickly, or vice versa, both of those situations resulted in an increased risk of developing lower back pain.
Which kind of makes sense, right? Because if you've got a real strength and real weakness pulling at both sides of your spine, I'm envisioning like a pole here, it's going to fall over like eventually, right, and put pressure. So that does make a lot of sense.
Yeah. And I think that's a metaphor that Stuart himself uses. So you've hit the nail on the head there, Matt.
Wow.
I think it's guy ropes on an old tent pole. If you've got one side pulling stronger than the other, then it's going to buckle. And that's the mechanism that he often talks about when it comes to spinal mechanics, is that buckling, which is more likely to happen when, as you say, you have an uneven pull.
To help protect against this, do you regularly stretch? Do you have your own routine that you go through?
Yeah.
Is it cross-training? How do you do it?
So when I was 26 and we were expecting our first child, I was changing my nephew's nappy, kneeling on the floor. And whatever that was, a few minutes, and I could feel my lower back tightening. Now, this was off the back of 6 years of recurring lower back pain. And I thought, I've had enough of this. I have had enough. We're going to have a baby soon. There's going to be lots of bending, lots of carrying. I can't carry on like this. So I finally started taking my own advice and started doing some exercises. And I did them 6 days a week, probably for about 10 years. until I cut them back. And I still do those exercises now, typically 3 mornings a week. And they consist of the front ones. So Stuart McGill again, the McGill 3, he talks about, if you're Googling now, you can Google the McGill 3. So I do his, what he calls the curl up, which is the one for your front muscles. And I do a side plank, which is the one for your side muscles. I don't do Supermans, which is, they're also called bird dog. They're the ones for your back muscles, because I've been doing another one for my back muscles for 20 odd years now, and I just stick to it. But yeah, I've been doing those for 24 years now, pretty consistently. And for me, it's about, I talk about this cliff of pain idea, and there are what we call preventers. I still have risk factors. I still do things that are in danger of pushing me closer to that edge. So I need to offset those by doing some preventative stuff. And that's what these exercises are all about for me. So I still do them, and I would highly recommend that people get in the habit of doing some preventative type exercise. For some people, it might be meditation. So maybe their biggest risk factor is they're one of these sort of catastrophizer type people, and that actually they need to calm their mind down and become much more calm and grateful for everything that they have. And maybe that would work better for them than doing physical activity. But yeah, that's what I do.
So stress plays, I'm thinking, a significant role in this as well, because you have mentioned meditation a few times, and we've talked about mindset a little bit. What I'm assuming, and the way that I kind of think about it for myself, is that you've got these regular exercises that you do, and I have a few regular things that I do, but it's all about bringing you back to that baseline, right? And sort of making sure you unwind from a mindset point of view and strengthening yourself from a physical point of view. Is that kind of an intelligent way possibly to look at this?
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. I mean, mind and body are closely got. I mean, to say that they're interconnected is just dumbing it down too much or making it seem more complex, actually, than it really is. The reality is they are physically and chemically connected. So what I often say to people when they're questioning the effect that stress has on their pain is that, look, stress is a volume control on pain. So it's not going to cause your lower back pain. It's not the thing that, you can't damage your back by being stressed. But if you have experienced any impact or injury that may have done a bit of damage, stress is really good at just ramping the volume up to the point that for some people, the stress becomes the biggest part of their pain. So actually, the tissue may have healed perfectly well. And let's face it, most tissues will heal. I mean, I was reading a piece of research the other day looking at what they call resorption of prolapsed discs. So if you prolapse a disc, a little bit of the jelly comes out of the jam donut, the jam comes out. But it turns out the bigger prolapses heal faster than the smaller prolapses.
Oh, wow.
But the most important thing to bear in mind is that they can heal. Your body resorbs. 60% of disc prolapses will resorb on their own. But a lot of people will go on to continue to experience pain. And why is that? And it's because the pain pathways have become established and people essentially learn pain. They get used to their pain and they worry about their pain and they focus on their pain, and it becomes a huge deal for them. Now, if you're sitting there and you're in this category and you're thinking, oh man, this guy's so full of I know, I understand what you're saying, but take it from me. Again, I had 7 years of pain in my 20s, got on top of it, got better. A couple of years later, I had a very stressful emotional event, and about half an hour after this news broke, my back was just killing me. It was just really aching. So I'm thinking, man, and I've got this to deal with, and now my back's really sore too. Now, fortunately, the emotional trauma thing resolved after a few days, and it was only after it went away and my back pain went away as well, I realized, I hadn't hurt my back. I hadn't done anything physically that could have triggered it. It was just the stress. It was the emotional upset had just triggered that old painful memory. So I know from personal experience, stress can be a massive magnifier of the pain that you experience.
And in doing a bit of reading and research for our conversation today, I came across a number of things which you put out on your own podcast about the use of drugs and medicine and the like. And you can maybe speak to your thoughts and attitudes towards it, I guess, but I really liked it because you, in some cases, support it short term, but never as a long-term solution to pain of any kind, because you're not fixing the problem, which is, I've had this conversation so many times, that you're never fixing a problem with this, right? You're just covering up the symptoms. So unless you're going to go back and actually fix the problem, what are we doing here? We're not moving anywhere really, right?
Yeah. I mean, again, it might be a bit of a slap in the face for some people, but, I always say, look, it wasn't an absence of pills or injections that caused your pain. So how are pills and injections going to solve it? They're not. They're a temporary patch. They help you to feel better. They ease the symptom. They turn off the alarm. They stop that alarm bell from ringing. And that, I think, has a lot of value if you're struggling to sleep. Sleep is really important, particularly from a kind of regenerative perspective. If your pain is such that you're really not getting much sleep, then fine, pop the pills under guidance. Some pills work better for different types of pains than others, and that's worth knowing. But don't use the pills in order to do things that would otherwise be painful. Pain is there and there's an alarm system. If you just numb it and carry on, best case scenario, you're not getting better, but worst case, you're numbing it. And so you're actually aggravating the injury all the time. So it's never going to heal. So yeah, I think they have a time and a place, definitely, but it's only short term. And then, you very much want to be, again, being active in your rehabilitation and not just sort of passively taking the pills.
And then there's probably one area that we haven't touched on a lot yet, and that's diet specifically. Do you have sort of your high-level views on what you need to do diet-wise in order to maintain a healthy back and in turn a healthy body, right?
Yeah. So yes and no. So we have a guy in our team who is a nutritionist. He's also a kettlebell instructor, Ralph, and I defer to Ralph's knowledge on this. So I think nutrition is hugely important in terms of health and lifestyle. It may very well be relevant for some people when it comes to both pain experiences. So some nutritionists will talk about pro-inflammatory foods, so foods that you might eat and drinks that you might drink that actually seem to increase your inflammation, and others that are anti-inflammatory. So, you don't even have to go as far as medical herbalism. There are just everyday foods that you can eat that seem to reduce inflammation. But, if you do go down the herbal route, there's things like turmeric that are anti-inflammatory. So there's all sorts of things that you can be eating that could be making it worse. And there's other things that you could be eating that could be helping. But I will put both hands up and say I am not an expert on nutrition when it comes to pain. So
fair enough.
Definitely worth looking into, but not my forte.
Just a couple of questions that I always do ask everyone for a bit of fun. If you have any book or documentary recommendations, because they're very important in these corona times to have a list of things to keep us entertained.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are struggling at the moment. I think you guys are well ahead of us in terms of coming out of lockdown, but pretty prolonged periods of social isolation for people faced with all sorts of challenges. So one book I often recommend to people is Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Yeah, highly recommend it. He was a prisoner, I think, in Auschwitz, a psychotherapist. And Man's Search for Meaning, well worth a read.
Oldie but a goodie, right?
Yeah, very. Yeah, I mean, that's just a massive book and so important for humanity. Another one, very practical one at the moment I'm reading is The Liberated Mind. And I apologize to him because I can't remember the author's name, but he is one of the founders of acceptance commitment therapy.
Oh, what's that?
So the abbreviation ACT it's a bit like cognitive behavioral therapy, which is giving you a set of tools with which to approach life and life's challenges. And ACT, just to give it a high-level description, although I'm probably not very well equipped to do this, but acceptance commitment therapy is about, as it says, is about accepting where you are and making a commitment to change. And this is where I come back to my cliff of pain concept and the importance of having a long-term vision. But ACT gives you a tool set to cope with everyday life and to become grateful for the things we should be grateful for and focused on how to change what we can change. That was a really bad description, but yeah, the liberated mind.
It sounds like some tools for really taking responsibility and getting a bit of maybe control back. So anything along those lines, I'm definitely in for. So now I do normally pre-warn people of this question, and I didn't with you. So if it doesn't work out, we'll take it out. But if you could have one law changed or implemented, what would that be? And you can take that any way you want. It can be about your profession, or you can go any which way you like.
I guess it has to be somewhere around, and I've probably not had enough time to think about how to answer this concisely.
That's all right.
But it would have to be somewhere around making sure that we're empowering one another rather than disempowering one another. So I guess I'm very focused on healthcare. And I think there's far too much in healthcare that, through no fault of the people who are doing it, because, they're the product of the system. They've all been taught this is the way to do it. So they're all still doing it. And the problem is we need to shift the conversation away from this kind of disempowering, passive approach to health, much more towards empowering and saying, do you know what? It's not that bad. You have the capacity to get that. The human mechanism is a wonderful thing. We can recover from all sorts of assaults and illnesses and so on. And let's focus on what you can be doing and support you to make those changes rather than just hope that it goes away by covering it with some drugs.
Well, that was a pretty good answer for a badly timed question in terms of letting you know about it. So you've done well. Now, your website is active-.
It is x.co.uk. So yeah, it's active and then a hyphen or a dash x.co.uk. And we're also ActiveX Backs on Facebook, Twitter are the main social media, and LinkedIn. Of course, I'm quite a big user on LinkedIn, always posting videos and stuff on there.
All right, perfect. And there's plenty on your website and that as well, with some different movement tips and that as well, which I watched today. So well worth checking it out. Gavin, I want to thank you again for carving out a piece of your morning to chat with me today.
No problem. Been a pleasure, Matt.
Hey everybody, it's Matt again. Thanks for listening. Just a couple of things before you guys clock off. You can get all Trench Talk episodes at xrm.com.au/podcast. You can also sign up for other goodies at the same site. Just plonk your email in there and you are covered. That's X for X-ray, R for Romeo, M for Mike.com.au/podcast. If you really like what I'm bringing you, please head to iTunes, subscribe to this show and leave a review right there. And lastly, if you want to contact me directly, type the @ symbol followed by Mr. Matt Reynolds into your search bar and you'll find all the social links. Goodbye.